All right, so we are live. With me today, I have once again Mark Allan Gunnells because he has a new book out. It just came out today. Happy book release day, Mark.
Thank you.
How about you introduce yourself just for people who might not know you around here yet?
Well, my name is Mark Allan Gunnells. I am a horror and thriller writer who's been publishing in the small press for, I think, about 11 years now, maybe 12, over 10. And just love writing, love publishing, love hearing from readers, all that kind of stuff.
I kind of like to poke fun at you with because you're very prolific. So I like to poke fun that you release a lot of books, and so I was wondering how many book release days do you have in a year?
It can vary by year. Last year, I only had one. I only had one book out last year. There have been years that I've had three out. There was one year where I had three out all within like a 2 month period from three different publishers, and that wasn't intentional because one book got delayed and then one book got moved up, and then they just all ended up coming out at the same time. And I mean, it's hard enough to pimp your stuff, but when you have several things out at the same time, then it can get a little discombobulating.
Yeah. The book that you released today is with Crystal Lake Publishing, and I'm very familiar with them. I really enjoy the stuff they put out, and the book is called Before He Wakes. Can you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about what this is? What this book is about?
Before He Wakes is it's just a pure suspense thriller. It's about two young people who have been kidnapped and are being held prisoner in someone's basement. Their captor goes out for supplies and gets involved in a horrific accident, and that leaves them trapped alone with limited food and water. And they have to start using all of their ingenuity and smarts to try to get out of the situation.
You gave me a preview copy, and I finished reading it yesterday, and I did a quick Goodreads review on it, and in it, I called it a nail biter. It's very much a nail biter. It kept me going from almost page one. I mean, it just doesn't stop, the intensity. So before I asked you to read an excerpt from this book, before we get into that, I do want to know, what was the genesis behind this story? Where did you get the idea for this? I always like knowing the answer to these.
It's kind of an odd origin story. I was randomly in my kitchen about to wash dishes, thinking about the movie adaptation of Stephen King's Misery. No particular reason, had not been watching the movie, had not been talking about the movie, but I specifically had a certain scene in my head when she tells him that she's going out and that he better hope nothing happens to her, because if she dies, he dies. And I just started to extrapolate that in my head, like what would happen if someone was holding you hostage and then something happened to them. I mean, even though they're your captor, they're also your only hope of, like, food and water. And so it just sort of spiraled from there. And then once I hit on the ending, that was when I really knew I had something.
Awesome. All right, so how's about we get into that excerpt, because this book is a lot of fun. It's a roller coaster. I think people need to read it just for that alone.
Well, I hope they will like it. I tried to make it fast paced. This is the cover. I only have a digital copy right now, but I love this cover. I think Crystal Lake always does really great cover art.
They certainly do.
I'm always excited when we get to the part where they put me in touch with the artist, and sometimes I give them some ideas. And with this book, I really didn't have a strong idea. So he went with something conceptual, and I really liked it.
It turned
So
out really well, yeah.
it really did. He went with the idea of the house as a cage, which I thought was really cool, and I love the color scheme. So I'm going to actually start reading from chapter 2, which is when one of the characters first wakes up to find himself in this situation. So I'm just going to dive in and read until I feel like I've gotten to a good stopping point. Okay. Patrick Young wandered through a dark tunnel, lost and cold and blind. Every so often, a brief flash of light would reveal images that he recognized but could not connect in any way that made sense to him. A dirty cement floor, a rusted metal bucket, a water-stained ceiling, a single dim bulb behind a wire cage. He didn't have time to adequately ponder these images because the light flares lasted only seconds, and then he was plunged back into utter blackness. Not just an absence of light, but a treatise against the very concept of light, a declaration that light had only ever been a myth, something imagined but not anything real. The darkness was so total, in fact, that he began to doubt he had an actual body, believing that he merely floated in an abyss that had swallowed the world. And there had once been a world, hadn't there? And he had been a part of it? Yes, he'd been a young man with a rich life, a sophomore in college with a boyfriend that he thought he might love, an interest in Impressionist art and Middle Eastern food, a fitness freak who liked to lift weights and go hiking. Or had all that merely been a dream? Patrick became aware that he'd made his way out of the dark tunnel only when the light started to hurt his eyes. And not a brief flash of light, but a steady, frosty glow shed from the bulb behind the wire cage and the water-stained ceiling. He no longer doubted the existence of his body either. He'd never been quite so aware of it, in fact. He lay against a cold, hard floor, and pinpoints of pain pricked his flesh all over like push pins stuck in a map. The worst pain was concentrated in his head, a thunderstorm rumbling behind his eyes. He lifted an arm that felt as if it weighed a ton and touched his left temple. His fingers came away tacky with blood. Patrick pushed himself up to a sitting position, though it took more effort than he would have imagined. The pinpoints of pain became hammer blows, and the room swam and spun around him. He felt vaguely nauseated, and the darkness began to reassert itself. He leaned his back against the wall behind him and took a couple of deep breaths to increase his oxygen levels for a boost of energy. Gradually, the darkness receded, like shadows fleeing from the rising sun, and his stomach settled. The aches in his body remained, as did the pounding in his head. Sitting up seemed all the movement of which he was capable at the moment. So while he rested, he scanned his surroundings. A small, windowless room, a perfect square that he'd guessed to be about 10 feet by 10 feet. The floor was gray cement. 3 of the walls, the one at his back, the one to his left, and the one straight ahead in which a heavy-looking door was centered, were rough stone. The wall to his right was blank white plaster. The room was empty except for 2 buckets sitting next to him. Leaning forward, even that small motion making him feel faint, he looked inside them. One was empty, but with dark stains and a foul smell he didn't want to contemplate. The other filled with what looked like dry dog food. Roughly midway down the back wall, a water spigot with a wheel-shaped valve. Reaching up again, he gently probed the wound on his head, a knot the size of a walnut, with an inch-long gash just below the hairline. Even though he barely pressed at the knot, it sent lightning bolts of pain ricocheting inside his skull. What the hell had happened to him? The last thing he clearly remembered was leaving his dorm room for an early morning jog around Furman Lake. He still wore his gray jogging pants, maroon sweatshirt, and Puma sneakers. He'd taken his usual route, down through the rose garden from the main campus before he started the circle past the dining hall and amphitheater, through the woods, then around the clock tower and Frisbee golf course. He could vividly recall coming up to the large parking lot by the bookstore, because he'd noted how few cars there were that morning. But then everything disappeared into that abyss from which he'd only recently escaped. Seems like a good stopping point. So,
Yeah,
just the tiniest little taste.
very, very good. That like I said, it's a very your pacing. You mentioned your pacing, and the pacing in this novel is it's very fast, and it really it's very addictive and contagious almost in a sense. So very good work on that. I think this might be one of my favorites by you, honestly, because well, first of all, I wasn't expecting more of a thriller. I mean, I would say there's definitely like a thriller vibe or a horror vibe as well, but it's very much a thriller, and but it's horrifying. Just the idea. I just want to mention before I get into my questions here that this is actually a big fear of mine. Of just walking down the street, or in this case, jogging down the street, and getting knocked out and then waking up in like a torture room. Basically, it's it's terrifying. Nobody wants to be in that position. I think maybe I watched too much television.
Well, I mean, that kind of stuff can be more terrifying than, werewolves and vampires and stuff like that, because, it has a more grounding in the possible. And
Yes.
so that in some ways makes it even more terrifying.
Very much so. A lot of advice you hear when you get into writing horror is to write what you fear. Is this something that you would also fear yourself? Like, obviously, there's a baseline. Nobody wants to be in this position, but is this something that kind of keeps you up at night at all?
It's not something I think of on a daily basis, but I mean, I am aware of the fact that, the world is full of crazy people. And sometimes you're just walking past them down the street and you don't even know it. And if you think about that too much, it can kind of mess with your head.
Yeah, for sure. There's one thing I really enjoyed that you did in the very first chapter is that you have an impatient customer waiting in line, and as almost like a writing exercise, because I know you work in retail. It's interesting that you would take that and jump into what a normal cashier would consider as an asshole, and write a small piece in their from their point of view. Um, was this the original beginning, or is this like something like an exercise that you tried experimenting with?
No, it was pretty much always my idea of how I was going to start it. Sort of set up the whole premise of the book that way. I'm also setting up something in that chapter for the end of the book that won't really be fully appreciated by the reader maybe until they get to the end of the book. But I always thought, I'm going to start there because it's really going to just kick off the whole premise, so that when I get to chapter 2 and Patrick wakes up, the reader will already know he's in a horrible situation, but it might be getting even worse, and he doesn't even know it yet.
Yeah. Speaking of Patrick, he's the main character, the hero. You did some really interesting things with him, because he goes into this situation thinking that he's a relatively peaceful person. He even does a lot of like Buddhist quotes, and he's one of those kind of people who shares those types of things online and with his friends. And but you put him in an extreme situation, and he realizes who he is. I was wondering if it was your intention to kind of screw with that sort of you don't know who you are until you get into a situation like that. Was that an intention, or were you just having fun writing the story, and that just sort of became like an interesting theme?
I mean, it sort of developed in the writing, because I tend to write very instinctually, and I don't do a lot of prep work. Now, this book did have a little more prep work than most things I've written, because I don't think this is a real term. I think I just made it up, but I call it an obstacle novel, because there's just a series of obstacles they have to get through. And because of that, I knew I needed to know before I started how they were going to get past every obstacle, because otherwise I might get them in a situation where I'm like, well, there's just no way they're going to get out of that. So I did set up all the obstacles and the solutions beforehand, but the character stuff I let develop as I was writing it. A lot of the Buddhist stuff came from my husband, who has an interest in Buddhism, and I've listened to a lot of like Buddhist monk talks with him. But then I just like the idea that if you're in a situation like that, sometimes your survival is going to require you to do things that ordinarily you wouldn't do. And I don't think that means that, you might not be an inherently violent person, but if you're put in a situation where it's life or death, you might be able to tap into some areas that maybe you wouldn't have thought, and you never would have before, and you never may again. But it's that drive to survive, really.
Yeah. And you mentioned the room that they're trapped in, and that you had the solution before or at the same time as the problem. And that was my next question, actually, because I found it one thing that kept me interested was, how are they going to get out of this? How are they going to progress? And how is the story going to move along? And so I was wondering if there was any research involved in in how to escape from a locked room with no apparent way out.
I wouldn't say, I mean, there wasn't a lot of heavy research, but I did want to make everything realistic. I wanted their solutions to be things that the reader could say, okay, I could see how they could do that. And really, for this book, what really helped was not just their ingenuity, but the time, because the fact that their captor was, MIA, while it meant that they were not getting food and water, it also meant they had a lot more time to think through ways to get out that they might not have had that luxury if he had constantly been there checking on them. So I just kept thinking, okay, if they're in this situation, and as the writer, it's kind of a cheat too. Like, I can make the room in the way it needs to be so that there can be a solution. But I did make sure, every step of the way, I knew every obstacle they were going to hit and how they were going to get out of it. And like I said, my main goal was to make it realistic, nothing crazy, no, hand of God reaching down to scoop them up. But, just realistic solutions that just the average person could come up with if they had the desperation to survive and the time to think it through.
And another thing I really enjoyed was every single time they think that, they might have made it, you present them with a new problem. And it's usually bigger than the first. I was wondering if do you ever feel a little mean towards your characters, like when you're writing stuff like this?
Well, I mean, I don't feel mean, but because I just want to be true to the story I'm telling, and sometimes the story is, horrible things happen to good people, sometimes for no reason.
For sure.
So sometimes, sometimes life is mean. So
For sure.
I'm just kind of reflecting that, but maybe to, a pumped up degree, for the dramatic of the fiction. But I don't really feel mean. I feel bad for them sometimes because, sometimes I love my characters and I want them all to get through unscathed, but also that's not going to be realistic. And I have to be true to the story. And sometimes I'm doing things to them I feel bad about, but it's what the story calls for.
For sure. I just like to, poke a little fun, because as I was reading it, I was like, man, Mark, who hurt you?
Well, I could get into a therapy session, but I won't. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I mean, this will sound odd, but maybe other storytellers will understand. But even when I'm writing the darkest stuff, it's still kind of fun. It's fun thinking up these scenarios. It's fun thinking up these situations. It's fun thinking of ways that they might get out of them, ways that they might not foresee they're gonna, just get into a worse situation. So I don't know. It's just all like play to me. It's all just like I never grew up and I'm still just playing make believe.
Yeah. One thing about this is because of its quick pace. I felt that I could imagine this as being a movie. Honestly, it was very visual. While I could tell it was your prose, there were some differences from past work. Sort of maturity, I would say. Did you approach writing this one like prose-wise any differently than the other pieces of work, like earlier works?
I wasn't really conscious of that, but like I said, the process was definitely different because I normally don't go in with any type of outline. So it really is just me getting an idea, tunneling in, and seeing what happens. This one, I did have a framework to the point where I did sort of a chapter by chapter before I ever started writing. And that probably had some effect on the writing because I wasn't discovering as much. I was still discovering some things, like, for instance, my little bullet point in the outline for chapter 11 just said, meet Claire's parents. And when I wrote that in the outline, I didn't really know who they were as people. I didn't know what they were going to be doing in chapter 11. I just felt we needed a break there, and it would be a good time to sort of meet her family and see what they were going through. And like I said, for that one, I just sort of sat down and started thinking, well, what would they be doing? But overall, it was a much more planned out book than some of the ones. And I don't mean that in a good or a bad way, because I love all my books. But I did approach it differently just because it was meant to be more of a fast-paced book. So that probably did have some effect on the prose.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Also, those parts, especially when you went outside the house where our characters are being held captive, and you visit basically how they got captured. Those parts kind of reminded me of Jim Thompson. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all. He wrote a lot of crime fiction, and sort of like books like The Killer Inside Me. It just had that sort of feel about it in regards to the characters and how they developed, and how everyone has something wrong with them, if that makes any sense. Everyone is flawed to a certain degree. And that's one thing I really enjoyed about this book, is that almost everyone has a flaw in them. And we even get to meet the sheriff who's investigating the disappearance of Claire, I believe her name was. And we learn that he's probably the best guy in this book, because he's actually very dedicated to his job. But he has to deal with a lot of people, like Claire's grieving parents, who also happen to be closet racists. And I found that as a very interesting angle. Now, when you're planning your book, like she said, you had like a bit of a skeleton of a outline, right? Was that part? Oh yeah, you just mentioned you didn't know who her parents were, but was there any idea of what her parents were going to be like, or was that a surprise to you?
When I did the initial outline, there was not. It was just, I felt it was important to break out of just the tight narrative. Sometimes that can work, like in Stephen King's Misery, where it's literally just two people in the house the whole time. Sometimes I think also what can be an effective tool in suspense is when you cut away at very high tense times, because then that leaves the reader with this anticipation of, I need to know what's happening there, but I'm having to wait while we have this little sort of side narrative. And I actually think that sort of delayed gratification. So I knew I wanted to do that because I think that can actually increase the suspense. But I didn't really know what her parents were going to be doing. I didn't know a whole lot about Patrick's boyfriend. I just knew I was going to have some scenes with him. Now, when I got close to that chapter 11, which I think is the first one where I introduced Claire's parents, I started to think like, okay, so what would they be doing? Obviously, they're grieving. And I had already sort of established what had happened in her abduction, her sneaking out to meet this boy that they didn't approve of. And that sort of informed that whole idea of then where I was going to go with their little side narrative. So really writing her abduction part helped me figure out what was going to be happening in the parts with her parents.
Yeah, and that's honestly another reason why I could picture this one as a movie, because it has all the parts that you could visualize without the inner monologue. You can just put it out there, and you still have all the elements. You make very interesting characters, and they all make very interesting choices. So kudos to you on that. Like I said, this one got me really excited. Not that your other work never got me excited, but this one, it just kind of took me by surprise. And I really enjoyed my read of it.
I appreciate that. It was an interesting experience writing it because I did approach it differently than the other stuff I write, and I wrote it very quickly. I probably less than 2 months to write that one. And sometimes it doesn't. I know the novel I had out earlier this year, 2B, also was written very quickly, and I did not outline that one. But I don't know, because the writing of it did feel different. I mean, it still felt like me. I was still having fun, but I knew I was approaching it with a different process. And it is exciting for me to know that, it seems to have worked and people seem to be responding well to it.
Now, last time I talked to you, I was asking you a little bit about your writing routine, and I asked if you wrote every day, and you do. You wake up early in the morning and you write before going to work and all that. But what I didn't ask, I don't think, was how many. I may have asked this, but and if I did, I apologize. But how many words a day do you crank out on average?
That it really varies because I'm the kind of writer, I'm disciplined in that I do get up early and write every day, but I'm also a kind of a no pressure disciplinarian in that if I get up in the morning and I write, I'm happy. Some days I might write 5 pages. Some days I might write 2 paragraphs, but I refuse to beat myself up about it. So it really can vary. On average, I would say at least 2 pages a day. But some days it might be a lot more. Some days it may be a lot less. Right now, some of that time I get up and I'm actually because I'm in promotion mode, I'm writing guest blogs or I'm answering interview questions. And then I'll write a little bit on whatever project I have on the go. But probably on average, I do about 2 pages a day at least.
Do you ever suffer from something that's called comparisonitis at all, or or you feel a lack of self-confidence in your own work that really kind of makes you stop?
Especially when I was younger, I had that just that feeling, especially because I'm also such a voracious reader. I'm reading so much great stuff that there is that temptation to think, oh, I'm never going to be this good. What am I doing? As I've gotten older, a lot of that has sort of fallen away. And I just realized, writing isn't a competition. I don't have to be as good as anybody else. I just have to be as good as I can be. And let's say if I knew for a fact that the best I can be was still not nearly as good as all these other people, so what? I'm still loving it. So I feel that much less these days. I tend not to compare myself to other writers. I tend not to, um, not just my writing, but like where I am. Like, there are other writers who are, definitely finding greater success than I am, and I celebrate that. And I'm just happy with where I am. So, like I said, the older I get, definitely the less that sort of stuff, you know, bothers me because I'm just trying to have fun and get my work out there to people who might have fun with it.
Do you ever find the and you can probably tell that I'm asking, because I'm personally interested. But do you ever find those thoughts creeping in anyway? Like, um, just like crippling thoughts like this, you don't even intend them. They just kind of sneak up unconsciously. Do you ever find that?
I don't find them crippling, but I have them and then I just sort of acknowledge them. I mean, usually, especially with the longer works as opposed to short stories, usually at some point midway, I always think, huh, so this might just be a piece of crap. Like, this might not make any sense. Like, I lose objectivity when I get to like the midway point, so I can't even tell, like, is this cohesive? Is it coherent? Um, but like I said, I don't find it crippling. I just sort of think it, and then I go, hmm. I mean, if it is a piece of crap that isn't coherent, then maybe it'll never get published. But I push forward anyway. I still just try to always find the fun in it. And usually, once I'm done and I let it rest for a little bit, and I go back to like do a polish, you know, it's usually much more coherent and cohesive than I thought when I was in the thick of it. And so that also comes to my mind. So if I'm thinking, oh God, this might be crap, I think, well, that other thing that you love, you thought that too when you were in the middle of it. So, just take it with a grain of salt. So yeah, I definitely have those thoughts, but I don't really let them cripple me, and I just push forward because, like I said, ultimately, if it not everything I write is going to be a masterpiece. So if I do write something that turns out not to be that great and nobody wants to publish it, I'm like, okay, well then I'll just move on to the next thing.
Do you have any works that nobody appeared to want?
Um, I have a couple of things right now. I haven't tried that many places with them though because they are sort of outside the genres I usually work in. So none of the publishers I normally work with are a fit. So I'm trying to figure out what to do with them exactly. Um, I have had works that sat for a very long time. Um, I wrote a novel before I had ever published anything called Sequel that I tried and couldn't get published and just sort of abandoned as well. That one is never going to see the light of day. Then after I had been publishing for a little while, I dusted it off. I looked at it. I really liked it. And I put it back out there and I did find a home for it. And there have been a couple of novels like that that have sat for a while before I finally found a home. But now I write a lot of short stories. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of short stories. So I have quite a few short story collections on the market, and that only skims the surface of the short stories that I have. So I have many short stories that have never seen the light of day. Some of them I've never tried to publish anywhere because I don't think they're strong enough. Others, sometimes I have stories that I love that I just cannot find a home for. And usually I just end up eventually throwing them into a collection. But I also find that if I am proud of a work, no amount of rejection is going to convince me I shouldn't be proud of it, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, totally. Oh, short story collections. You have how many short story collections do you have out right now? Your shirt is a short story collection.
it actually is Companions in Ruin.
Yeah.
I think I have over 10. I'm not in my office with my vanity shelf right now, but I want to say I have 12 short story collections out. So I'm a little bit of a short story.
Yeah. You actually remind me of another writer that I really admire, Steve Rasnick Tem. He writes a lot of short stories, and I don't think he has nearly as many as collections as you do.
I love short fiction. I always have, and it was always like a dream of mine to have. I wanted to be one of those writers who had just a lot of short story collections. And it sounds weird to say since I have so many now, but at the very beginning, I did not get any interest in it because, publishers are not as, psyched about doing short story collections, especially with writers who aren't, super famous and successful. So it took me a while to even start getting publishers interested. But luckily, I'm stubborn and can be obnoxious. And I've been lucky to find some publishers that were on board and excited. And I'm always very proud when I have a new short story collection out, because as much as I love doing the novels and the novellas, I have a special passion for short fiction, so that always excites me.
Do you have any number in mind of how many short stories you may have written?
I just know it's hundreds. And I mean, they date back to when I, was like a teenager. So, and I mean, most of those, the oldest ones, you're never going to see. I have published in some collections some of my stories from my like college years, but yeah, the junior high and high school stories, no one's ever going to see those. But yeah, I'm just, even when I'm working on a novel, I might take a break for a few days and write some short stories, either for specific, anthology calls that I've seen, or just because I have an idea that won't leave my head. So, I mean, the number just keeps growing.
Yeah. Do you still I mean, one of the advice that writers get when they first start is to submit to anthologies and magazines, write those short stories and do that. Is that something you still try to do? You see a submission for a themed anthology and you're like, oh, that sounds awesome. I have an idea. And you go and write it. Do you still do that?
I do. I mean, just this past month, I have written several stories specifically to submit to anthologies. I mean, I grew up loving anthologies. There were a lot of anthologies I read when I was in my late teens and early 20s, like Book of the Dead and Under the Fang and Shock Rock. And I would, in my head, even though I had never published anything, I would think like I would love to like be in these kinds of collections. And sometimes I would write a story and think, oh, that's a total shock rock kind of story. So, and I also think for writers, sometimes an anthology is a great way to get exposed to readers because, at my level, like, I have readers that I'm very grateful for. When I have something out, when I'm promoting it, though, a lot of the times I'm just promoting to the people who are already familiar with me. They're the ones who are seeing it. In an anthology, you might get somebody who buys the anthology because of another writer that they're a fan of. And maybe they'll read your story and think, oh, well, that was interesting. Let me see what else this writer has. So I don't have any marketing numbers, so that may be just made up in my head, but it feels to me like that's a good way to expose yourself to readers who aren't yet familiar with your work. So yeah, I'm always still looking for anthologies and stuff like that to apply. And I love there are two different monthly flash fiction writing challenges I always submit to. One Crystal Lake Publishing does, and the other Cemetery Gates does.
Mm-hmm.
I love that challenge of getting a theme and then trying to think of an idea that you can fit into a compact little, punch of a story. So yeah, I'm always doing that sort of stuff.
How, that brings up an interesting question because writing very short pieces like flash fiction has always been one hell of a struggle for me. And it's because I tend to be wordy and I want to go into various different places. How do you write? How do you do flash fiction? Can you give me like a quick lesson?
I mean, one, the idea has to fit it. I mean, there are ideas I have that I know, okay, that's a cool idea that I want to write, but I can't write it for this challenge because there's no way that's going to, fit. Um, but I have like a short story writer's mind. Like I feel most comfortable in the short story. So um, I don't know. And to me, it's kind of a challenge to see like, here's a little idea. I think I can just get it out in 1,000 words. Um, so I know this isn't being very helpful, but I just sort of I cut out all the unnecessary fat, and I just get to the heart of what is this idea. And sometimes it's might have a full plot. Sometimes it's just sort of a vignette, just sort of a moment, a character study, something like that. And I also find I write them a lot when I'm stuck in a novel, like if I'm struggling with something in a novel and I need to take a break. Um, I'll go and write some flash fiction because usually I can write a whole flash fiction story in one sitting. And that kind of gives you a boost of confidence and this feeling of accomplishment that usually like sort of lifts me up so that when I go back to the novel, I have this new confidence and I can usually work through whatever problems I was having at the time. So I didn't really give you any tips there, I realized, but like I said, it's really just about knowing, because I can usually look at an idea and I can't tell you exactly how many words it's going to be, but I know if it's going to be a short story or more of a longish short story.
Is there a difference? Like, if there was a difference between a piece of flash fiction and a short story that's around 7,000 words, what would that difference be?
Maybe complexity. I mean, it's not that an idea for a flash piece can't be a complex idea, but it has to be something that can be expressed simply and quickly. There are some ideas that are going to require more setup, are going to require more characters, who are going to require more of a build so that the payoff is going to be satisfying. But with flash fiction, sometimes I just have these ideas that I know are just like almost like a quick jab. Like it's really just going to be this moment. It's really just going to be this scene. It's really just going to be these two characters interacting. And so no matter how complex the idea is, I know the execution can be done simply. And like I said, other stories, it's going to require a more complex structure. And therefore, you're going to need more room for it to grow.
Awesome. You mentioned sometimes you're writing a novel and you get kind of stuck and you'll go write a piece of flash fiction or a short story. I was wondering if do you ever juggle projects a lot, or is this just when you run into a problem with one and you kind of need to let it simmer for a bit and so you'll move on to something else?
I never juggle more than one long project. Like I'm never writing two novels at the same time. The only exception to that might be there have been some times in the past when I've collaborated with other writers, and there have been some times I've been working on a solo novel at the same time. And that's only because when you're collaborating, there are chunks of time when the other person is working on it. And then that frees you up with a chunk of time to work on another project. But typically, I'm only writing one novel at a time, but I will take breaks throughout the novel to work on short stories. And so I will do that because, like I said, short stories I can usually do pretty quick. And they're not too much of a distraction. I feel like if I was trying to do two full novels at the same time, it would just be too much and I would drive myself insane. So yeah, but short stories I can fit in periodically when I'm working on something longer.
Very cool. Um, so I wanted to, before we go, I wanted to discuss writers that we read a little bit, as this is predominantly a booktube channel, and actually I had no intention whatsoever in going to the short story route, but kind of went there. But that's pretty much how I found you, was through your short stories, and I really enjoy your short stories, and just recently been getting into your novels more. So what writers would you say had the biggest impact on your own writing, especially when it comes to short stories?
Well, when it comes to short stories, I know this might sound odd, but the television show The Twilight Zone, which are, in some ways just little short stories on film. I watched that a lot when I was a kid, and it really sort of informed my idea of horror. And particularly, a lot of my short fiction, I think, has sort of a Twilight Zone-esque feel. So definitely, like, that was a huge influence. And even though it's, very cliche at this point to say, Stephen King, I know he's known for these, long epic novels, which I also love, but um, I mean, the first thing I ever read by him was a short story, and I love his short stories. And he has that ability, I think, to really concentrate it down so that you feel like you're getting a complete world and a satisfying story, even in a short amount of words. And then Clive Barker came along with his Books of Blood, and that just sort of blew my mind in what was possible. Um, just the boldness of his vision, his willingness to just take these completely bizarre ideas that shouldn't work, but he makes them work. He had a huge influence on me. Um, and I'm trying to think other, because I do love, especially if there's a writer I'm interested in trying, one of the first things I do is see if they have a short story collection out, because I feel like that will give me an idea of all the different things they are capable of. Even though it's not horror, there's a regional writer in my area, Ron Rash, who I think does excellent short fiction. Um, I'm trying to think.
Are you a big fan of like anthologies, like Year's Best Horror and whatnot?
Like someone, especially in my early 20s, I read a lot of anthologies. I loved the themed anthologies like Books of the Dead and Under the Fang and Shock Rock. And even though I was a little late to it, I went back and read Dark Forces, which is sort of considered like the premier horror anthology. And I don't read as many of them now as I should. I keep buying them, but I haven't read as many. But I do love, and for the same reason I mentioned as a writer, as a reader, it exposes me to writers that I might not have been that familiar with, because I've definitely done that. Like, oh, I bought this anthology because it had a Clive Barker story in it. But then maybe it also had a Brian Hodge story in it. And Brian Hodge is another writer who I think he does some of the best short fiction that's out there today. But I might discover him in an anthology, and it's so good, I want to go see what else he's done. So I do like anthologies a lot.
Awesome. Who are you reading? Who are your go-to writers today? Who do you like reading the most?
Oh goodness, there are so many, but they're the ones I grew up with, the ones that I still go to, which are, Stephen King, Clive Barker, even though he doesn't put out that often anymore, I'm always there when he does. Joe Lansdale, and then and Anne Rice is someone I discovered when I was younger, and I still love her work. And I've discovered a lot of really cool writers in the small press publishing world. I'm always down for anything new by Aaron Dries or James Newman or Brian Knight. I've recently discovered some really cool writers. I don't know if you're familiar with Gabino Iglesias,
Hmm.
but he does great work. So I've been buying up everything by him. I've recently gotten into Tananarive Due, um, and I've been buying up everything of hers.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, I've really gotten into Sarah Pinborough, um, who has done some great stuff, and I know she's, this year particularly because they made the Netflix adaptation of her book Behind Her Eyes.
Hmm.
But that is an excellent, one of my favorite, twist ending books. Like that was when this book, Before He Wakes, and my last book, To Be, both have somewhat twists at the end. And even though they're nothing like her book Behind Her Eyes, I kept in mind how well she pulled off the twist and how she kept it fair so that if you go back and read it after you know the twist, it still all tracks and makes sense. So I use that as sort of a blueprint. But I could be here all day because there are so many writers that I love. And if I love a writer, I'm going to keep going back to them. And I love a lot of writers.
Are you the type of reader who, when one of your favorite writers releases a book, you buy it as quickly as possible and devour it right away?
I always buy it right away, but I have so many that I love. I know sometimes I have like 5 of my favorite writers have a book out around the same time.
Yeah.
So they're gonna get on a backlog. But I mean, I recently finished a book by Clive Barker called Galilee.
Mm.
And I bought that book brand new in hardcover when it was released 22 years ago. And I just read it.
Yeah.
So I've literally had that same copy for 22 years. And again, it's just because there's so much I want to read. I bought it, then I started reading some other stuff. And then I read books he wrote after that one. And that one just kept getting pushed to the back. And then
Yeah.
22 years later. So they don't always get read right away. But I love to support the writers I love, and I like to buy their books right away because I feel like that's going to help them get those numbers up. And so yeah, even though I might not get to it immediately, there are writers I buy immediately.
Yeah. You know what? I read Galilee about 10 years ago and I absolutely adored it. What did you think of that?
I loved it. I thought it was beautiful, and there was this great world building in it that it just, even no matter what the crazy fantastical elements were in it, it felt real and grounded. And I liked that it ended in a way where I felt he clearly was leaving it open for a potential sequel that hasn't happened. It still felt satisfying. It didn't feel like it just ended abruptly. Because I have read books like that where, and then maybe they don't write the sequel and then you're just sort of left hanging. But
Yeah.
this felt satisfying, but still had the potential for more. But I thought to me, it reminded me of some of his works like Weave World and Imagica, which are just these epic fantasies, but he makes it feel so real and intimate that you just sort of get sucked into that world.
Yeah, for sure. That's pretty much how I felt. I need to reread it though because I don't remember much of it now. It's been like 10 years or more. But I remember that being my favorite Clive Barker, which is saying something because, you got the Books of Blood, you got Weave World, as you mentioned. There's so many good things that he's written. And to say that Galilee, this underappreciated book that nobody ever talks about by Clive Barker, saying that's your favorite is, yeah, I got to wonder why that fell under the radar. I guess maybe because it is very different from
Yeah.
other things.
And, it's just, there definitely is, because sometimes there are writers where, there are certain works of theirs I love so much, but I'm like, this is one that nobody ever talks about. But in some ways that sort of makes it feel like, almost more personal to you because it's like, well, it's my little secret.
Yeah, this is mine. You guys can keep your books of blood. This one's mine. Uh, okay, so before we go, what would you say is your favorite book so far of 2021 that you've read? It doesn't have to be released in 2021, but what would you say would be your favorite of the year so far?
Oh, goodness, I've read so many good ones. One of my absolute favorite that I read this year, it was not released this year, but is Coyote Songs by Gabino Iglesias. That one just really it impressed me with its depth and its almost lyrical language, but a very gripping, very relevant to what's going on now story. I loved that one a lot. Um, I loved Galilee, which I just finished again, 22 years after it came out. Um, I also read a short story collection by Tananarive Due called Ghost Summer, which was excellent. And I actually went back and I read Toni Morrison's first published novel, The Bluest Eye. That one was great. I read a short story collection by Craig Gidney called Sea Swallow Me that was great. God, there's just been so much. But yeah, I think probably if I had to pick one, it would be Coyote Songs by Gabino because it was really, really good.
Very good. I hear a lot. I mean, I haven't heard anything bad about that book, and I want to read it. So I got to get my ass moving on that one.
It's definitely worth it.
All right. So I think that's it for now. Thank you, Mark, for coming on and discussing Before He Awakes. Now, if anyone's wondering, it's out right now. You can go to Amazon.com and you can buy the ebook. Is it available in a physical copy at all?
It is. You can get the ebook or the paperback. They're both available on Amazon.
Very cool.
So yeah, I'm just gonna keep pimping that. But
Is it going to be available as an audiobook at all? Do you know?
It's possible. I know that Crystal Lake is getting more into audiobooks. A book that I wrote for them with Aaron Dries called Where the Dead Go to Die just got released on audiobook.
I got to check that out.
Yeah. So I haven't signed anything yet, but it's very possible that this one too will end up on audio. But I am very excited because, like I said, it's more than a lot of the stuff I've written. It is just such a pure suspense thriller where I don't think I sacrificed, character or anything, but it really is just my attempt to just a fast-paced roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to hear what people think of it.
If anything, regarding the character, I don't think you sacrificed character at all. If anything, you built on character by putting them in these intense situations and making them react and being surprised by their own reactions. And I could probably talk all day about the characters in this book because of how it connected to me and how I recognize these characters definitely not as like copies or anything like that. Of like I was talking about Jim Thompson. It had the same flavor as maybe some like Jim Thompson crime fiction, and so I just got all shivery inside. I was like, "Ooh, this is good."
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
All right, thank you, Mark. And as usual, anytime you have something new, feel free to hit me up and we'll do this again. And actually, I should do that before we go anywhere. Before we leave, do you have any other releases coming out this year?
Possibly. There is an older novel of mine that's out of print that may be getting a re-release later this year, but I don't have any specifics on that yet. But I'll be sure to let everybody know if I find out. Yeah, but there's nothing definite on that yet.
Any idea of when your next short story collection might be coming out? I'm sure there's going to be one in the future, right?
I have been talking to a publisher about doing one in 2022, specifically collecting some of my most Twilight Zone-iest stories. Haven't signed anything yet, so I'm not gonna, say anything specific, but I am already in talks with the publisher about doing another
Awesome.
collection.
I really enjoy your short stories because there's always such a contrast in each story. I like to, as I say every time, I'm sure you're sick of me saying this, but there's a contrast between cruelty and kindness, and it almost feels like you're reading very much what humanity is. Either people can be completely awful and cruel to each other, or you get these heartwarming stories here and there that make you kind of want to cry because you know that's possible too. But you just read this story about people doing terrible things to each other.
That's one of my favorite things about doing a collection is that you can offer such a wide variety, like the smorgasbord of just all different types of stories. And sometimes I purposefully like to put like a dark, violent story right next to sort of a light, feel good story, because like you said, it's part of the journey of life and humanity, and it's nice that contrast can I think make each story seem a little stronger just by playing off each other.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Mark, and I look forward to the next time.
I always enjoy talking to you.